We're living through a great reshuffling, the fastest and most profound reshuffling in human history. It includes a reshuffling of markets and business models and organizations, and eventually that's going to mean a reshuffling of education and talent development. You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Tom Vander Ark, and I have the pleasure to be joined by a repeat guest, Sangeet Paul Choudary. He's the author of Reshuffle. He's going to explain that to us. Reshuffle, the subtitle is Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy? Sangeet, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Absolute pleasure to be here.
You're joining from Dubai.
That's right.
We're really glad to have you on. You and I had a chance to meet and do a little bit of work together 7 or 8 years ago around the last revolution. You wrote a super important book called Platform Revolution, and it came out right while I was writing a book on platform networks in education. So we both are giving thought to how learning organizations connect on platforms, and your work was really the most important for me in explaining the last economy, and that's why I was so excited to see Reshuffle, because I think it's the best explanation of what's happening and what will happen in the new economy. Sangeet, I want to jump into an explanation that you made both in your book and on your Substack, which I really want to encourage everybody to subscribe to the Substack because it's really terrific. But you explained, I don't know, about 2 months ago that there's a value creation chain that's existed for a long time. It hasn't always been evident, but the value creation chain is curiosity, knowledge, curation, and judgment. And our audience knows this well, but for thousands of years, education has focused on that middle component of knowledge transmission and accumulation. But now as knowledge, as expertise becomes commoditized with the rise of generative AI, suddenly there's a shift in the value creation chain, and now the beginning of that chain with curiosity, I would say problem finding, opportunity recognition, and the back of the chain of curation and judgment are suddenly much more important. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so, because what's really changed with the rise of generative AI is that we have application-oriented knowledge. We have knowledge that can be synthesized and made relevant in a way that can be directly applied. So a lot of people say that, the information age has been around since the web came up, and Google has always been there for the last 20 years. But having access to more information doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right access to applicable knowledge. And what becomes possible today with generative AI is that you can apply knowledge in very specific ways to actually solve problems. So usable, applicable knowledge is much more accessible than before. It's been decoupled, or what I call unbundled, from the training and the skills and the investment required to acquire that knowledge, because traditionally that's what all of us have seen our path through education and into our careers as a way to train and acquire that knowledge, which we can then charge a skill premium for. Some of that knowledge is now readily available with a prompt. And so depending on the type of knowledge that we're talking about and the nature of its application, some of it is getting commoditized. So my key argument over there is that traditionally, the role of education has been to kind of get us better at storing the answers and retrieving them at the right point of application. But if the cost of accessing answers, if the cost of accessing knowledge goes down, then what becomes more valuable is asking the right question. And that's where the idea of curiosity becomes so important. When knowledge was scarce, you could afford to be less curious because you could just compete on the basis of the knowledge that you uniquely had. But when knowledge is abundant and everybody has, to some extent, access to very similar troves of applicable knowledge, then asking the right questions becomes very important. And there are two economic reasons why asking the right question is important. The first is that, you ask the right questions, you get to the right answers, and you are able to leverage all this AI enabled knowledge access that is there in the right way. But the other aspect of it is that if you don't ask the right questions, the opportunity cost of asking the wrong questions can be incredibly high, because you typically follow a path of inquiry and you might just go down the wrong rabbit hole. And so, despite the fact that you have access to a lot of applicable, synthesizable knowledge, you may just be on the wrong path and not be able to apply it to solving your problem. So, curiosity becomes very important for that reason. And for a very similar reason, curation becomes very important, because when you're asking the right questions and you're generating answers, you're synthesizing, you're developing insights, you need to know what to include and what to exclude. As we've seen with AI in general, just because it's very expressive and verbose does not mean that it provides all the right knowledge and at the right place and right time. You also need to curate it. You need to understand what's right for your situation. You need to understand what's right for the problem that you're facing. And eventually, the value sits with judgment, and judgment is the ability to isolate the right path of action based on what you've learned, and then absorb the risk or assume the risk associated with taking that action. And I think in a world where knowledge itself becomes commoditized, these aspects become much more important. Framing the right question, choosing the right answers, and then having the assumption of risk to actually back it and take those consequences on you.
I want to go back through that value chain again. We're talking about this value chain of curiosity, knowledge, curation, and judgment. The way you described curiosity was not just being a boundless curiosity, but an intentional curiosity. That sounds like
Right.
Reid Hoffman suggested that we're invited into a sense of super agency. Do you buy that link to agency, identity, or like a purposeful or an intentional curiosity?
I believe the idea of curiosity is definitely intentional. What you're trying to do with that is you're trying to compress the solution space towards answering or towards achieving the specific purpose you're aiming for, right? So in mathematical terms, you're trying to reduce the number of axes along which you pursue your exploration. You're trying to manage the number of parameters based on which you want to explore. And so curiosity is less about being generally curious. It's less about, some kind of a fuzzy trait that you have about asking the right questions all the time. It's more about the fact that when you're faced with uncertainty, and I can get into why the idea of uncertainty is important, but when you're faced with a very wide spaced problem and you have access to this treasure trove of knowledge on the other side, knowing how to constrain that solution space by identifying the right variables, identifying which issues are worth pursuing and which ones are not, and hence framing your questions accordingly is actually what I mean by curiosity. So it is definitely very intentional. And when you're faced with uncertainty, that's what gives you agency, giving that forcing function through which you can compress a solution space.
All right, let's talk about the back half of curation and then judgment. Curation requires a level of expertise because you're stepping from a primary role as a creator, whether that's a coder and a writer, an artist, and shifting your focus to curation.
Mhm.
So that's a different set of skills. Can you do that without a significant cognitive offload? Does curation require more or less a cognitive load? I guess we're worried about that in education, that if you're stepping out of the primary creation role, are you, is that a higher or a lower cognitive load?
Yeah. The way I would think about it is that these four elements are very tightly connected. You can't develop the ability to curate unless you've actually worked through solutions, curated them, assumed the risk associated with implementing them and then seen what the consequences are. And when I say risk and consequences, this does not relate to really building products and seeing products fail. It relates to every conversation we have. When we're
Right.
taking a stand in a certain conversation and we're saying that stand being rebutted or that stand being reinforced, we're constantly getting feedback which improves our taste in terms of how we curate, how we make those choices. So, to a large extent, you can't be a good curator unless you actually work through the entire value chain. You can't just insert yourself in somebody else's value chain and say that I'm here to curate all of this information that's coming through. You need to go through the entire cycle. You need to go downstream and see the consequence of what you've curated in the past. That is what helps you develop that taste, and that those signals help you improve that taste over time. And a lot of it is not, we associate the idea of curation also with algorithms. When we say that Amazon is curating your feed or Instagram is curating your feed, that is all very mechanical and pattern recognition. A lot of what human curation involves is more of understanding the narrative that needs to form around diverse data points. It's understanding how to bring individual pieces of a solution together and create a coherent outcome. So it's really the larger coherence in the narrative, in the system, in the overall design of whatever you're building. That's where curation becomes important, rather than just saying, here are the pieces that are important and now let's bring them together. So it's very different from the way curation is done by algorithms and feeds and so on.
I think also included in curation and judgment is a higher expectation for what quality looks like, right?
Mhm.
If we could do a 5-paragraph essay in an hour last year, the the opportunity to produce something better, longer, more engaging, now has to be part of this curation and judgment, a higher expectation of what's possible. We're still grappling with that in education, where the predominant mentality now is cheating. Is AI, are you using AI to cheat, rather than what is possible now as a working with a co-intelligence and curating what could we do that we couldn't do a year ago. Judgment. Tim Daisy called that wisdom, and called for colleges to become wisdom factories. Is that part of applying judgment?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with thinking about curation and judgment is that it lends itself less to, I would even say standardized testing, but any form of evaluation. It's a lot easier to evaluate what we traditionally think of as knowledge. It's a lot more difficult to evaluate curation and judgment, not just because they are very contextual. The same decision in a different context could be disastrous, but in one context could be really powerful. And the same thing applies to curation, but also because it's difficult to evaluate, the larger coherent system that you want to create. Let me give a simple example. When machine learning took off, when data analytics, or even before that, when data analytics took off, and in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we had just the ability to pull up different types of data visualizations and pull up different types of analytics. The value of pulling up the analytics or the visualization went down. The value of telling a story, a compelling story that links that to larger business outcomes, that links multiple unconnected data points towards a larger story. That's what became very powerful. I mean, that's where the TED stage became so powerful, and the idea of owning the narrative became so powerful. So my point is that a lot of curatorial framing, as we see in these instances, are more difficult to evaluate and are also more contextual, which I believe also then requires us to unbundle how we think about education. Because when the output of education was a one size fits all knowledge that can be then contextually applied in different contexts, you could have one size fits all education systems. But if curation and judgment are so contextual, you also need to move how you teach and train that closer to the point of application. So that I think is one key issue that we need to think through in the years ahead.
We're talking to Sangeet Paul Choudary, is the author of new book Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. Thank you for that insight. It's just one of the examples of how Sangeet explains that we're in a new era, and the value creation chain is being reshuffled. I love how you apply that to the individual, to the task, the job, the organization, and the ecosystem. That's really the structure of the book. Jumping to the end of the book, chapter 8, as this beautiful discussion of AI as a tool versus AI as a engine. Right now, we see most organizations sort of bolting on and automating some stuff that may or may not be useful, as opposed to thinking about AI as an engine. Talk about those differences.
The idea of AI as a tool versus AI as an engine really came out of a desire to kind of contrast what the real impact of AI is going to be versus how we are looking at AI today. And this is not an issue that's unique to AI. Whenever there's a technological shift, the first motivation or the first instinct we have is to apply the new technology to make a faster version of today's way of doing work or today's system. And my key argument is that in order to really get the benefits of a new technology, you need to reorient your entire system, whether it's your workflow, your organization, how you compete, the product you build, the process through which that product is brought to market. You need to reorient everything around the capabilities of this new technology. And we've seen this before. We've saw this with the shift to cloud computing. I talk about the example or the contrast between Adobe and Figma. Those listeners who are designers would intimately understand the difference between the two. But really, the key difference was that even though Adobe adopted the cloud and shifted its delivery model and revenue model, its overall business, its overall architecture remained the same. It was all structured around the design file. But what the cloud allowed was it allowed you to have a centrally hosted design project, which did not have to be set up at the level of a file. Every single element could be manipulated, could be moved around, and multiple users could work off the same central version of that project. So really the way Figma organizes work is around the element, and permissions can be managed at the level of an element, a design element, and Adobe does it at the level of a file. And that essentially means that Figma reimagined what design meant given the properties of the cloud. Because before the cloud, you could not do this element level management. And with the cloud, you could. We see this with AI as well, because if you look at the rise of TikTok, TikTok, in hindsight, seems like a Chinese social network taking off because it was more video oriented, targeted a different user base. But really, if you look back at history at 2017, 2016, when TikTok was beginning to take off, analysts had largely declared Facebook the winner of social networking and YouTube of video simply because their network effects were insurmountable and because the logic of social networking was built around the idea of a social graph. You needed to connect to your friends before your feed would fill up. And TikTok essentially dismantled that whole logic. It allowed you to see value even after a few clicks, swipes, even without connecting to anyone. So while Facebook and Instagram was structured around the social graph, TikTok is structured around what is called the behavior graph. And the behavior graph is made possible because of AI, because the ability to track what users are doing, and on the basis of that, build a behavior profile and then connect different attributes of that profile with each other into a behavior graph. That's really what helps you instantly connect into the universe of activity that TikTok has, and yet get the most relevant items sent to your feed. So TikTok changed the basis of competition. Figma changed the basis of competition. The key idea is, if you're thinking about the role that AI can have, whether you are in the education industry or any industry for that matter, your first instinct might be to use AI as a tool. And Instagram and YouTube did use AI as a tool to make their recommendations better, but the logic of social networking remained the same. Adobe did use cloud as a tool to deliver better, but the logic of design remained the same. If you want to really build a business that extracts and delivers the value that AI can bring in, you need to reimagine your business around AI as the engine and rethink what it takes to create value and compete in your industry, which is exactly what Figma and TikTok did. So that's the key insight that I really talk about.
That's well described in the book Reshuffle. You also have a beautiful recent Substack on the Figma versus Adobe. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Just to summarize this idea, you wrote, strategy is less about how to use AI and more about envisioning the future systems that emerge with AI. I think that's super important. And as school leaders are going back to school this year, most of them are thinking about where and how they can use AI. Many of them have adopted one of the Swiss Army knife tool sets that have many different little apps that automate this or that. That's probably of some use, but at best, that will produce some efficiency. I just want to stress, I think your lesson here is that the separate task is about envisioning the future systems that emerge with AI. That would you agree that you need to do a bit of both of these things of adopting and improving while imagining the future system that will emerge?
Yeah, I think you do need to do a bit of both, and you need to be careful about where you do what. The one thing that I would caution against is doing the former, which is using AI as a tool to improve what you do today, and betting the house on that, and saying that that's the future school that you're building, and or that's the future education system you're building.
Yeah.
You need to do all of that just to stay in the game. But that's not going to give you the ability to win the race. It's not going to give you the ability to compete
Yeah.
at a different level. You need to reimagine what you do around the capabilities that AI
Yeah.
provides. And that essentially, I take an example further down in the book as well about the fact that education is unbundling at three different levels. The unit of education in terms of the course itself is unbundling into smaller modular units. The unit of certification in terms of the degree is breaking down into smaller levels of micro credentials, and the unit of work, as opposed to the traditional 9 to 5, is breaking down into many different forms of work. And so education has always been sort of this three-party market, if you will, of education providers, job providers, and the learners. And there's unbundling happening at every level. And AI simultaneously provides the ability to rebundle or restructure these into new combinations. And that's what thinking of it in terms of an engine would look like, where you really reimagine what a learner's journey would look like around the capabilities that AI provides.
All right. The big idea in your book, the one that I'm still grappling with, is you argue, yes, AI can automate some potentially useful stuff, but the power of AI is in supercharging coordination of complex systems. Explain that, because I haven't got my arms around that yet.
The idea of coordination is something that I bring up because very often we associate AI with the idea of automation alone. And what I call out right up front is that AI, whether, in whatever form, whether it's today's generative models or whether it's machine learning or whether it's some other statistical form of pattern recognition, all these technologies have two properties when it comes to how they impact work. They impact the execution of work. Previously slow manual processes can be automated, yes, but more importantly, they impact the organization of work through coordination. And the reason I place emphasis on coordination is because by its very nature, all all forms of AI do three specific things in order to work. They create a model of reality. It may not be accurate and a high fidelity model of reality, but it's a model of reality that helps them solve certain problems. They use that model to make decisions, and on the basis of those decisions, they support action around or support execution around it. And so, this idea of creating a model of reality lends itself very well to coordinating fragmented systems, whether they are fragmented bodies of knowledge inside an organization, whether they are your fragmented notes from different meetings that you attended in and now need to provide or manage a workflow across different teams, or whether it's fragmentation of information across companies in an industry. The ability of AI to model all of this and then support decisions and execution on top of that is actually what I believe the real value of AI is. And that's the idea of AI as a coordination engine. A simple way to think about this is if you think about organizations have always had a trade off between team autonomy and cross team coordination. Coordination problems in organizations are solved using meetings and using documentation. And typically, the more autonomous a team gets, the more it imposes a coordination tax on the rest of the organization because it starts moving in its own direction. And what AI can help us do is it can help us solve this trade off because the ability to model an organization's information and knowledge base and then have every team work off that, whether the employees themselves or whether more agentically the AI tools enabling them, that combination can potentially help us solve that autonomy coordination trade-off. So that's why I believe the idea of coordination is so important. I repeatedly stress on this idea because of that.
That's it's a powerful set of ideas, and it's really promising. Organizations, whether they're corporate or educational, have gone through these phases of centralizing everything and decentralizing everything. And I think you're arguing that we've been stuck on a limited continuum, and that we actually have the potential now of having high coordination and high autonomy. Is that fair?
Yeah, you can solve that trade-off where higher autonomy used to lead to low coordination and better coordination used to restrict your autonomy. You can potentially solve that trade-off if you deploy today's technologies well within your organization.
Historically, to have high coordination, high autonomy, it's required a high degree of consensus. But I think you even argue that AI enables coordination without achieving that consensus, that you can step into high coordination relatively quickly, right?
Yeah, I think this was, an insight that I gathered after having worked through many AI implementations. And the idea is that the ability to model a version of reality and then make decisions and run execution on that basis, essentially, in order for these technologies to be effective at execution, the model has to be really good. And so over time, we've seen modeling or perception capabilities of these tools improve. And what that does is it can take highly fragmented, unstructured information and extract structure and extract a view of reality on the basis of that. An example of this is just, the meeting notes that a Zoom or an Otter type of software provides you today if you let it join your meeting. It's taking highly unstructured, incoherent conversations and abstracting a relevant set of notes, and you can structure it anyway. You can ask set up the right prompts and get the right forms of output out of that. So this idea of taking unstructured information, if you extend that and you think about all the unstructured information in an organization or all the unstructured ways in which companies across an ecosystem exchange information, PDFs, emails, calls, and so on, if all of that could be fed into an AI system and it then extracts structured information and creates a structured representation of what is being exchanged, that can then serve as the basis for coordinating parties who have not actually agreed to coordinate in the first instance. Because traditionally, the way we coordinate is we agree to some standards, we agree to set up information in some formats, we agree to share information in some formats. But AI's ability to manage and work with unstructured information enables this form of coordination without consensus.
And to make this super tangible, whether you're in business or education, I think that means that it could lead to a level of coordination among organizations using different metrics and measures very quickly without the year-long process of arguing about which metrics and which measures. That we now have translation engines that will allow rapid coordination without the arguing to get to a set of agreements about one assessment or one metric or one measure. So this is really promising. Sangeet, I left your book encouraged. It made me think about systems more than tasks. It made me rethink value creation. I think you just nicely moved past many of the sort of limited debates that we're having today, and it sort of stepped people up to the balcony to think about what's possible. And so we really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate it. Really glad to hear that. Thank you.
We've been talking to Sangeet Paul Choudary. He's the author of Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. It should be the new textbook for business education. We think young people thinking about the future ought to read this. Organizational leaders, whether you're in education or business, I think could benefit from this great study book. It's challenging. It's interesting. You do a nice job of using stories to both new and old to make these topics come alive. So we
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thanks for being with us this week. Thanks to our producer, Mason Pasha, and the whole Getting Smart team that makes this possible. Until next week, keep learning, keep leading, and keep innovating on the big reshuffle. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.